I bought a 486. Wait, did I? I have been furnishing my house lately, often after a couple drinks. Sometimes I forget what I've ordered. Phew. It is, in fact, a computer. The question you're asking right now is why? Why a 486 desktop in 2021? Why when you have so many other computers that do the same things as well or better? Well, let's look at this machine and I'll explain. This is going to be a two-parter, so we've got a lot to cover. Over the life of my channel, I've shown you a bunch of the computers I've got lying around. From my original IBM PC to my Apple IIs to my modern tower. In fact, here's a playlist, there's a lot more than that. But I've also got a bunch of computers that I haven't yet featured, including a couple of old Macs, a really interesting Japanese Fujitsu notebook that used to be my wife's computer, and more. Surely there's nothing a 486 can do that none of these other machines can. Well, no, there isn't. But that's not the point. It never is. See, it's not about utility. It's very much about nostalgia, but it's also about the particular niche in computer history that the 486 occupies. It was the transition between a bunch of different eras.
Want to run all your software fast? Then look for the Intel Inside symbol on your next computer. It says you've got a real power source on the inside. Like the upgradable Intel 486 microprocessor. Power it up and run your software at light speed. Intel, the computer inside.
And of course, coming at the tail end of the DOS era, a good 486 can run almost any DOS game that you throw at it just fine, as well as 16-bit Windows games that modern systems have trouble with. My first ever IBM-compatible PC was a 486 SX25 back in 1993. I have no remnants or even pictures of my own of that machine, but it was a cheap piece of junk Packard Bell Legend 2000 multimedia. It wasn't cheap in price. I remember it costing $17.99 in 1993 dollars. But it was so cheaply made that it couldn't even run the resolutions advertised on the box. And Packard Bell had to send out extra VRAM to everybody who bought one, including me. At the time, I didn't know any better. Hey, I'd been an Apple II guy up to that point.
Got a Packard Bell for 86SX, 20 megahertz. I got a hard drive with 100 megabytes, 2 megs of memory. I got a monitor, it's Super VGA, and a printer, it's 24-pin. I got accessories and software like Windows and Lotus Works. You put it all together just for $14.98. That's what it's all about.
But I remember asking for it as a college computer because it was the cheapest name brand computer with a CD-ROM, which I remember telling my dad I needed for, quote, film production, which is what I was studying. You guessed it though, I just wanted to play some games. Believe it or not, my Silver Tower is a direct descendant of that original Packard Bell. I just replaced every component in it one by one until it was a completely different computer. Now you can, of course, just play DOS games through DOSBox on a modern PC. And I do that. But there's something a little too inauthentic about it for me, playing DOS games through emulation in a window in a GUI with a modern keyboard and game controllers. There's no one thing that's a deal breaker about it, and of course we all have our own particular lines in the sand. I don't demand the complete retro experience. I resolved a long time ago never to buy another CRT, for example. But I'm somewhere nearer to that extreme than the opposite. Hey, this is a hobby. I get to make my own rules. So I've wanted another 486 for a while now. I've been checking eBay off and on and watched as the prices actually rose over time. Unbelievably, a lot of 486 machines now sell for $400 or $500. Some specific machines have even become desirable on the collector market. I really wanted a nice Gateway 2000 machine. That's what I wished I'd had back in the day. But they've become too rich for my blood. Meanwhile, supply has really dwindled. Unlike with game consoles, which are smaller and somehow just feel more preservable, people seem more willing to part out or just recycle old PCs. So major brands that used to take out giant ads every month in Byte or PC Magazine are basically nowhere to be found on eBay. Micron, AST, Xeos, Austin, and others that I remember well just don't turn up for sale these days very often, if at all. Many of those old components are probably now in parts machines cobbled together by other YouTubers. But occasionally a half-decent deal pops up. I finally pulled the trigger on this, a mostly stock Compaq Deskpro XL 466. This is a 486 DX66 model that was released in 1994, really in the twilight days of even the 486. It was pretty high-end as 486 machines go, being part of Compaq's top line and being identical save for the processor to the Pentium machines higher up in that line, and it was intended for heavy business use. Not just spreadsheets and word processing, but things like MicroStation or AutoCAD. It was a workstation class machine. This was not the later HP-owned home-oriented Compaq that made Presarios and sold cheaper rebranded HP machines. This was the original Compaq that reverse-engineered the IBM PC, helping create the PC-compatible ecosystem, and that was still competing with IBM on its home turf.
Excuse me.
Oh, what?
Why so many computer add-ons?
I need to accomplish a lot, so I need a computer that will do a lot.
The new Compaq Deskpro has those add-ons built in.
I need lots of programs.
Deskpro runs thousands of business programs.
I need speed.
Deskpro's 2 to 3 times faster than yours.
I need storage.
Inside the Deskpro, capacity equal to 30 diskettes.
I need a vacation.
The new Compaq Deskpro. It simply works better.
I need my desk back.
As mentioned, you can of course just build your own 486 machine out of cast-off parts, and there are pros and cons to doing that. Obviously, you're still going to be mostly working with used hardware, and some may be in better states of repair than others. Consider this blog post about a 486 build that took 2 years of part sourcing and troubleshooting to get everything working the way it should. I believe that, given how finicky a lot of these parts were in working together even when new, let alone with close to 30 years of use on them. In the end, though, you'll have parts you picked yourself and a system that looks, sounds, and plays just how you want it. These are all considerations when building a modern PC too, but the hassle side of the equation is just amplified to the nth degree when you're talking stuff that's 25 or 30 years old. That said, I wouldn't be opposed to doing it as a project for its own sake sometime, and plenty of other YouTubers already have. But for me, the nostalgia itch doesn't just come from the games, but the specific manufacturers and computers that were around at the time. I remember machines from IBM, Compaq, Gateway, and others. I always wanted to experience them at the time, and many I never had the means to until now. It's fun to see how they decided to build systems, and to preserve those systems. And it's usually a bit cheaper and a bit easier, even with all the effort you're about to see me put in. Consider that everything following this, including part 2, was filmed over about 3 weeks. Let's take a look around this machine and see what it's got inside and out. This is my first time taking it out of the box, so it's also the first time I'm going to see what kind of a project I have ahead of me. And it's already pretty clear I've got kind of a project. But we'll get more into that. Obviously, you can see that this computer came with absolutely nothing, so I'll be needing to add even my own power cord, keyboard, and mouse. Luckily, I have a PS2 Model M keyboard that was my actual daily driver in the late 90s. I have about 1 million computer power cords, and I know I've got a PS2 mouse around here somewhere. The front of the case makes it obvious how chunky of a computer this is. Unlike most machines of that era, it has 3 exposed drive bays, and this is one reason I chose this model. It also has 2 hidden bays inside. My Packard Bell had just 1 full-size exposed drive bay, a second cutout that would only fit a 3.5-inch floppy drive, and a single internal hard drive bay. It was just a much smaller computer, but that was not a good thing in the 486 era. I do intend to add a CD-ROM and eventually a 5.25-inch floppy to this computer, so 3 exposed bays was a must. I intentionally bought a desktop, that is, a horizontal form factor, because it just feels a little more era-appropriate to me than a tower. Towers really took over in the Pentium era. This was also the tail end of manufacturers still trying to copy IBM's original PC designs. Try to forget for a moment that you know what a PC is supposed to look like. That's been conditioned into you over the last 40 years. Try to remember back when other computers like the Apple II, basically any Atari computer, the TRS-80 and Commodore 64 and 128 existed, among many others, with their unique designs that looked very different from the IBM PC. Nobody had to make a computer that looked like the PC. Now look at the IBM PC AT and Deskpro XL, and despite 10 years between them, tell me you don't see the resemblance. That was not a coincidence. But the 486 era was the last time it was this obvious. That said, the Deskpro XL apparently came with a stand so you could use it as a tower if you wanted, which makes it a little irritating that whoever owned this computer before obviously just stuck it vertically on its side on the floor. Then they kicked it around like a soccer ball, scratching it up. Inside of the computer also seemed to play host to a small spider colony at some point. I'll be literally clearing the cobwebs out of this thing. The front of the computer will clean up nicely, but the case is a mess of damaged paint, and in part 2 I'll be taking a rattle can to it. We'll see how that works out, but anything would be an improvement over this. I do not promise perfect color matching, but I do want a clean look. Looking at the back, you can see what kind of I/O is built into the motherboard and get a hint of the expansion cards loaded up inside. On the far left, we've got audio input and output ports for the onboard audio. This was about the time that became a thing in pre-built systems, though this particular implementation seems pretty nice, with its Yamaha YMF262 that's arguably better than the YMF289 in my Sound Blaster 16. Next, we've got this weirdness. What the heck is that? Well, these computers originally came with what Compaq called the Vocalist Keyboard, essentially a keyboard with a built-in speaker and microphone, and this is their proprietary port. Again, mine didn't come with that, and I'm not sure I want to buy a rubber dome keyboard separately. That's what the Vocalist is. Next to that, though, we have the standard PS2 keyboard and mouse ports, so I can just use my Model M. Then 2 serial ports, a parallel port, a SCSI port, and then something I'll bet most of you have never seen before. No, that's not a game port. That's a 10-base-5 AUI Ethernet port. Basically useless today. I'd have no idea how to even test it. A more standard-looking RJ45 Ethernet port is next to it. By this point, you can see that a lot of PC I/O was already contained on board. So this computer only has 3 expansion cards in its 5 usable slots, and it doesn't even really need that many. We'll look at these internally in a minute. The first gives us a VGA output, and next to that we've got yet another networking port, this one for IBM's token ring standard. So clearly this really was used as a business computer. Token ring had basically zero uptake as a home networking standard, but it was popular with businesses. In the last slot you see the telltale RJ11 in and out ports of a modem. This was clearly a pretty well networked computer for the mid-90s. So let's open her up. It took me about 15 minutes to figure out how to do this. I can be a little dense sometimes, but finally we've cracked it. So here's an overview of the inside. The motherboard is pretty tiny, but there's a fairly good reason for that. You can see that this is an extended ISA and PCI system, which is pretty uncommon in a 486. But then this computer did share almost every component with its Pentium brethren. On the right side, looking from the front and attached to the drive base stack, we've got the Connor 550 or 535 megabyte SCSI drive, depending on who you ask. That was a decent size in those days. My Packard Bell came with a 170 megabyte drive, which I upgraded to 340 megabytes a couple years later. And SCSI! Macs had SCSI drives, but in PCs it was considered a high-end feature and kind of exotic. This PC also supports IDE drives, and you could order it with either, but businesses often preferred SCSI for reasons. Business reasons. The middle of the computer has this pretty innovative fan duct, which is actually cooling the CPU, and interestingly, this whole assembly is kind of like a car's anti-sway bar. It makes the whole case a lot more rigid. Now, you may have noticed an odd P slot when we were looking outside. Well, the CPU is actually housed on a vertical daughter card, along with the system RAM, accounting for that missing chunk of motherboard. This was common in compact computers at that time. The CPU itself sits right next to that big fan and its duct, which then blows straight out the back of the PC. From what I gather, these processor boards are actually interchangeable, so I believe I could theoretically buy a Pentium board like this one and just stick it in here. This board has all of its RAM slots filled, but it's not maxed out. it's got 24 megabytes of the possible 128 megabytes of RAM it could have. 24 megabytes was still quite a bit back in 1994. My Packard Bell came with 4, which I later upgraded to 12, although not until about 1996, and that cost me $170 back then, or $283 in modern money. I remember taking a class on computer animation in 1994 or 95, and using an SGI Indigo with 32 megabytes of RAM, and I thought that was an almost unimaginable amount of RAM for a single computer to have at the time. Consider that Windows 95 required 4 and ran happily with 8, and I don't know of any DOS game that ever required more than 16. So 24 megabytes was pretty damn good and should work fine for me. 128 megabytes would just be nuts. Next, let's take a look at the graphics card, and it's pretty interesting too, at least to me. This is a Compaq QVision 2000, aka a Matrox MGA Impression Plus. This was a high-end graphics card that would run you about $500 separately, or close to $900 today, and that's without scalpers scooping up all the graphics cards. These cards were built by Matrox and just rebranded by Compaq. And interestingly, they were the first cards on the market to support 3D in hardware. They didn't support texture mapping, so their usefulness in 3D gaming is limited, but they were supported by 3D software apps like AutoCAD. One of my own upgrades back in the day was purchasing a Matrox Millennium card along with a new motherboard and case. The Millennium was well known at the time for its blazing Windows performance, its excellent image quality, and its good DOS gaming performance. But by then, I'd mostly moved to Windows anyway, where its Windows acceleration, as we called it in those days, really set it apart. The MGA Impression Plus actually predates the Millennium, and it's much the same card, but with slower VRAM. I'll have to see if this card is really going to work for DOS gaming, but I do think it's interesting to see it included in a pre-built system from Compaq. Most systems at that time were using cheaper options from companies like Cirrus Logic. You can guess what my Packard Bell came with. And lastly, for completeness sake, here are the IBM Token Ring adapter card and the Best Data modem, which looks to be 33.6K. These aren't very useful to me anymore, and I'll probably just remove them from the system, which will free up another couple slots and a few more watts on the aging power supply. Heck, maybe I can throw a Voodoo card in there someday with those resources freed up. One of the first things I do with any old piece of computing or electronics equipment is to check for any obvious motherboard damage or bulging capacitors. Luckily, this motherboard seems to have no electrolytic capacitors at all, and neither does the graphics card. The previous owner did say that the CMOS battery is dead, and stupidly, this is soldered to the motherboard. I'll be tackling that in part 2 of the video because it's more annoying than you might think. But at least it hasn't leaked, and it's not the type that generally does. So no need to worry about it just yet. Time to finally give this thing a good cleaning and see how it really looks. I really like to do this a little earlier in the process, but just couldn't help myself opening the thing up first. First, I hit it with the vacuum to get the obvious loose dust. Next, some disinfecting wipes just to kill the germs on the parts of the case that I'll be touching from this point forward. Then I move on to some alcohol spray and swabs. And lastly, for any really stubborn marks, I use a magic eraser. You do have to be careful with these, as they're almost like a very fine sandpaper, and you can take any light textured finish right off. But the front and back of this case cleaned up really well, as you can see. The metal top and sides are another matter. Since this is a business-oriented machine, there is no game port at all. I mentioned that I have a Sound Blaster 16, and I've literally been looking for a computer it'll work with. So I'll throw that in to take over both for the onboard sound and to add my required game port. This is the era that the Sound Blaster 16 was made for. I'd previously attempted to use it with machines that were either too old or too new, and I never did get it fully working on them. Hopefully it's not just a bad card, but we'll see. With everything checked, cleaned, and sanitized, it's time to fire it up and see what we've got. This computer has one of the early 14-pin VGA ports, but luckily I have an adapter left over from my IBM P70. This monitor is not ideal even for an LCD, but it's what I have and it'll do for testing purposes. Here we go! Oops, might want to make sure the monitor plug is actually in there all the way. So, first impressions. This computer's loud and whiny, as older computer systems like this often were, and it's no doubt gotten worse over the years. For reference, here's a recording of the startup taken from right on top of the drive stack. The two main culprits are actually the case fan and, more predictably, the hard drive. This seems to be some early form of PWM fan with a 5-pin proprietary connector, and I believe that's actually PWM electrical noise that I'm hearing, maybe mixed with a little vibration, not mechanical noise. It actually sounds less annoying as the computer warms up and the fan goes faster. I'll be doing what I can about that later. For now, I just want to make sure everything runs as it should. Standards were different in the 90s, so I don't even know what this computer was really supposed to sound like. With the CMOS battery dead, it's necessary to run the setup program every time you turn the machine on. This isn't like a regular BIOS setup. It's more of a guided process, but it's actually pretty advanced if you want to really get into it. This was the standard way of configuring an ESA system, something Compaq led the design of. It does recognize plug-and-play cards automatically, but to set up my Sound Blaster 16, I had to create my own config file and define all of its parameters. Luckily, you only have to do that once, and then it'll load from the disk next time automatically. But it still doesn't happen instantly. It takes a minimum of 3 to 4 minutes to get through the whole process. So if Windows hangs or something and I need to power cycle, it's a real pain. Also, if I were to lose the hard drive at this point without a backup, I'd be a little screwed. Speaking of which, experience tells me to scan the hard drive for errors before doing anything else. Ah, ScanDisk, my old frenemy. It did find a few errors in the file system, not uncommon for early Windows machines to be honest, but nothing wrong with the surface of the drive. That doesn't mean I'm safe, especially with a drive with this much bearing whine, but it does mean I probably have enough time to at least prepare properly for transferring over to solid state. Yeah, just like LCD versus CRT, the benefits of making that switch outweigh the risks, noise, and nostalgia of staying authentic, even for me. So I'll show you the hard drive running in this video, but by the next I'll be cloning this drive to CF card and shutting the hard drive off. If nothing else, that will extend its life. I did a quick dive back into the trials and tribulations of the autoexec.bat and config.sys files, something I remember obsessively optimizing frequently back in the day, but which I've forgotten probably more about than I ever knew. Windows 95 kills these startup files when you install it, so I had to remake them from scratch. I installed my Sound Blaster drivers from floppy disk and let it make the changes it wanted to as well. Let's take a really quick look at the Windows side of things, and as usual, apologies for the moire effect. That's a camera artifact and not visible in real life. The white background probably isn't helping. I'll just go through this quickly so you don't have to stare at it for too long. Incidentally, I never did find my PS2 mouse, so I'm doing all of this with the keyboard. I do have a mouse on order. Old computers are often interesting little time capsules of their former owner's life, but this one is pretty well cleaned, or it just wasn't used for much to begin with. It's got a mostly stock suite of apps on it, plus a few extra things like ICQ, Netscape, and MS Office, although these honestly may have been pre-installed too. The last change date I can find in Windows Explorer is May of 2000, but it doesn't seem like there was much use after about mid-1998. Which makes sense. By then, the 486 was pretty ancient and obsolete, and if you needed a workstation class machine like this, you certainly weren't using one. The final user seems to have been a young person who needed a word processor to look for a job, so I'm guessing it was handed down or possibly sold for cheap. There are a few personal files in the root folder that I'll bet the last owner just forgot to clean. I'm not going to show them, especially because this machine seems to have been owned by a few people, and I discovered without even intentionally looking that there's some sad aspect to all of their stories. It actually seems like kind of a cursed computer, but I'll hopefully be changing that. Positive vibes, people. Actually, the one thing I did search for was why this copy of Windows 95 was registered to Rod Canyon. You may or may not know that he is one of the co-founders of Compaq Computer. Were all Compaqs registered this way, even after he left the company in 1991? Was it a joke? Or did Rod Canyon actually own this computer? It was in the course of trying to figure that out that I learned some of this computer's history, along with its owners. Although I never did find out if Rod Canyon was ever one of them. But probably not. Incidentally, the onboard sound does work. Here it is. And after installing the Sound Blaster drivers and spending way too long configuring them, here's the sound switched over and working on that card too. Yes, the Sound Blaster is a bit louder at the same volume setting, but as we all should hopefully know, that doesn't necessarily equate to sound quality. They both sound pretty good to me. The obvious thing to do with any old computer is run Doom, so here it is, version 1.0 from the original shareware disks. Seems to run about as expected for a 486-66, so the graphics card is holding its own. I will say there's an odd problem where I get these vertical splits in the picture unless I run Windows first and then exit out to DOS. Very weird. But I think it might actually be the monitor that's at fault, since it's running at a weird resolution, 320 by 200, that I doubt it's really made for. I don't know why running Windows at a high resolution lets it finally run an odd low resolution properly though. By the way, 320 by 200 is not 4 by 3, that's why I call it odd. Here's Frontier Elite 2, the second game in the Elite series, which was one of my favorites on the Apple II. I love the intro music. This was one of the early software-based 3D games. Interestingly, there's not a lot of texture mapping, if any, so this is probably a game my QVision card could have accelerated if the developer just supported that. Here's another software 3D game called Stunts. I played the hell out of this when I was in college, and designed a bunch of my own tracks for it. It's basically a rip-off of Atari's Hard Drivin', but it's far superior to any of the official ports that game got, and it has a track editor and a replay mode. It's really fun. I used my joystick to play this game, so that's a 100% success for the Sound Blaster 16, and everything on this machine is fully working, except the battery. Incidentally, I took a minute before sealing the case back up to try to lubricate the case fan and hopefully quiet it down a bit. I pulled up the sticker and put a drop of Kato Uniclean oil on the rotating spindle. Maybe a little unconventional as far as oil goes, but if it's good enough for model trains, it's good enough for a computer fan. I fired it back up and... well, I think it sounds about the same. The sound stops the instant I cut the power, so I do think it's actually electrical noise, suggesting another of the same fan will probably sound the same. I'd love to replace it with a modern 92mm fan, but I haven't been able to find a pinout for this weird fan connector. Notice it has a blank pin at pin 4, or pin 2, so it's different from other 5-pin connectors I've seen. I've seen adapters for HP-era Compaq 5-pin connectors, but they have a blank at pin 5 rather than pin 4, and I don't trust that they just swapped only those 2 pins. If you've got any suggestions, leave me a comment. Now, you may have noticed that I've been playing mostly small, older DOS games, and that's because I'm actually downloading them on another PC, writing them to actual 3.5-inch floppy disk using a USB floppy drive, and then installing them as if I was really living in 1994. So at least I know the floppy drive works too. I'll soon be installing a CD-ROM drive, and literally all of the old DOS games that I still have are on that format, so I'm looking forward to that. How to get software onto any old machine is always a consideration. In this case, I could use a null modem cable and lap link, or I could even connect via Ethernet to my home network using Windows 95. But right now, the easiest method for me is actual 3.5-inch floppies, since I still have my wife's old USB floppy drive and a bunch of old blanks that came with other systems. So that's going to be the end of part 1 of this video. To recap a bit, we've looked at what makes the 486 era unique, why I bought this machine, we've cleaned it up, tested it, explored both its hardware and the contents of its hard drive, added a Sound Blaster 16 to get full gaming capabilities out of it, played a few games, and made sure it's working as it should given its current hardware. In part 2, we'll take everything a step further and paint the case, come up with a solution for the dead soldered-on battery, transfer the hard drive to compact flash, install a CD drive and play some games from that, and just generally make it a computer I can actually live with in 2021.